All right. To get through the people analytics maturity progression, we need to understand the roadmap to get there. And what I'm going to introduce now is what I call the change model and process. And it starts with assessing and exploring and then creating and then taking action. And let me break these down in a very clear way, hopefully. Assessment is what you've likely heard time and again over your career. You have a current state assessment and a future state assessment. Many go straight to a future state assessment. This is where I want to go, and they just plow ahead to get there. It's a fine approach in some cases. Some would, kick me in the shin and say, absolutely not. You have to understand where you are first before you can decide where to go. I am more of that ilk. However, I have heard good arguments that, hey, if you can get really focused on where you want to go, you'll kind of leave some of that legacy stuff behind. With that said, let's just take the current state assessment and future state assessment and not dwelling too much on the future state, but if you can understand where you are in terms of your people, processes, technology, and the data within those technologies, as well as the governance around them. So you can now say, okay, we have gaps. And if we want to develop a future state where we're having executives consume this insight and taking appropriate action, that we're going to have team leaders have visibility into how workers are spending time so they can adjust workloads and empower people to do work better, particularly at home, then we're going to have to shift some things. We're going to have to create a way forward. So how do you do that? Well, I advocate employing what I call the AVR process: audit, vision, and roadmap. So if we audit where we are now, develop a vision for where we want to go, and create a roadmap on how to get there, we'll end up, in my experience, in a good place. What that requires is space. We need the time to explore what's possible, and we need the right people in the room contributing to that exploration. And let me land on this word for a bit. Explore means offer ideas. It doesn't mean put forth recommendations and try and get your agenda advanced. It is really what is possible. What if we did this? Some people are very uncomfortable in that space because, hey, we just got to make a decision. We got to move forward. That's how bad decisions are made, particularly when we talk about systematic challenges across the employee life cycle or worker experience. We have to think systematically. I've been, frankly, challenged over the years that, Al, you're trying to boil the ocean. I'm not trying to boil any ocean, frankly. What I am trying to do is launch a boat that won't sink. And we thus have to think about the whole system, because if there are holes in it, it is in fact going to sink. It's going to do one of two things. It's either not going to work, or it's going to generate insight that's suboptimal. So for us to do this work well, we have to consider the key elements, and we're not going to do that without auditing what these are, creating a vision for what we want them to be, and developing a roadmap, including priorities with what we're going to do over time. And that takes this notion of exploration. Once we get through that, there's this all tough place of decision making. We actually have to decide. So then it invites the question, whose job is it to actually make the decision on how best to move forward? And this is where governance comes in. So it's of my belief that people analytics leaders are first and foremost facilitators. I've heard this language time and again over the years. Well, I own this, I own that, and I don't think it's a healthy mindset. I think at the best, you're a curator of a data set. You're a facilitator of a process. We own very little in organizations. It's an organizational asset. So how we think about it and how we use our influence has to be very consciously thought through. But ultimately, in my view, I would think the chief executive, or at the very least, a CHRO, would be owning the decisions on how best to move forward. Once we make those decisions as an organization, we have to create the way forward, create the reality, bring it to life, in other words. And that takes some, again, I'm going to use the word again, creativity. To think it's linear, to think, okay, we're going to implement that tool and everything's going to be, fine. That's not the way it works. Particularly now, and given the uniqueness of the work environment with remote work, with diversity and inclusion and safety and social justice matters, we have to create new experiences using digital technologies. And with that, we're going to finally be able to go to this last bubble and take appropriate action. We cannot do that, however, without thinking through the whole process and having that in hand so we can know where we are, know what we have to do subsequently. The final thing I'll say on this is that as we go through, we have to empathize with the individual, so what's often called the employee experience. We have to think about the team experience. We think about groups within our organization, so diversity groups, job families, and what have you, and then finally the overall organization. These can be almost viewed as different stakeholders, so it's, again, not just creating insight for the organization, it's understanding the dimensions and who the customer is at the end of the day. Much more to share on this topic, but for now we're going to take a break and we'll be back with Scott Burns of Structural.